Welcome to the American Counseling Association's 2021 Asian American and Pacific Islander Advocacy and Action virtual program. My name is Kent Butler, and I serve as ACA's 70th president. On behalf of our more than 55,000 members, I am proud to welcome you all to this very important conversation that comes at a critical time in our nation's history. Today, you will hear directly from policymakers on legislation impacting the AAPI community, with a focus on mental health and education. Licensed professional counselors help all people, no matter their age, culture, race, sexual orientation, or immigration status. It is written in our code of ethics, and it is who we are. It is our responsibility to advocate for our clients, when appropriate, to address potential barriers and obstacles that inhibit access and/or growth and development. As counselors, we are trained advocates, and our core beliefs are rooted in understanding our clients' diverse cultural backgrounds. Discrimination and violence have increased at an unprecedented rate during the pandemic. The challenges faced by the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community has intensified. ACA has the desire to not just be a leader amongst our peers in the mental health and education communities, but to take action in a purposeful and consistent manner to improve the nation's failures as we see it today. Counselors are co-conspirators, and as such, we serve as strong advocates to the AAPI community. As president of ACA, I am committed to working closely with our leadership, staff, and membership to ensure that ACA remains an active voice in advocating for policy that support the overall well-being of AAPI communities. Our expertise as counselors is vital. Our legislators, in their quest to improve policy for AAPI community and all underrepresented communities. Today, you will hear from Representative Judy Chu, a Democrat representing the California's 27th District. Representative Chu is the chairperson of Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. We also have the honor of hearing from two of our nation's most active state legislators in AAPI community. Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos from Washington State and Senator Chris Lee from Hawaii. Each will share their perspectives on the work they are doing to support this important cause, as well as what counselors may do in their states to advocate for meaningful policies that support the community and the counseling profession. After today's session, please visit the Take Action page on ACA's website. Here you will find information that will help you advocate on behalf of your Asian American Pacific Islander clients and colleagues. While you are there, please also respond to Action Alert, another avenue for supporting the AAPI community. Your response will make a difference as it goes directly to your federal legislators. If you have further questions, please reach out to the government affairs team by emailing advocacy@counseling.org. Again, that's advocacy@counseling.org. Thank you for participating today. I will now turn it over to our CEO, Richard Yep, who will moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, and hello to all of you who are attending our event. We have a very special session planned, and as Dr. Butler referenced, we are honored to be joined by three of our country's strongest advocates on AAPI civil and human rights. As professional counselors, you all experience the growing needs of the general population in regard to mental health issues that adults, adolescents, and children are facing. All of this has been exacerbated over the past 18 months given the COVID-19 pandemic and growing racial discrimination and hate crimes. We also know that people of color disproportionately are affected with various conditions that damage their mental health and well-being. And for example, the Kaiser Family Foundation found that as of April 2020, almost half of Americans reported negative impacts to their mental health related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So to address this growing crisis, the Bipartisan Policy Center's Rural Health Task Force has recommended adding mental health counselors and marriage and family therapists to the list of Medicare-covered providers to try and meet the increased demand for mental health services. I think we all know that many of these problems can only be solved when elected officials take responsibility for creating public policy that addresses these issues. We know that elected officials at the state and national levels are key to finding solutions, and we are honored to have 3 advocates with us tonight. We want them to know that our 55,000 members acknowledge and appreciate the good work that they are doing. And I also want to share a personal reflection. Many years ago, as a young legislative aide on Capitol Hill, I was in awe of the work of a group of Asian American elected officials for the work that they were doing on behalf of their constituents and for the AAPI community. The efforts of Senators Daniel Inouye and Spark Matsunaga, as well as Representative Bob Matsui and my boss, Norm Mineta, gave me hope. I want you to know that as we hear from this next generation of elected officials who now carry the torch for the mental and physical health and the education and civil rights of all Americans, I am even more hopeful of what will happen in the next few years. So at this time, I want to introduce Representative Judy Chu, who was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2009. Representative Chu, as Dr. Butler said, represents the 27th Congressional District of California. She sits on the powerful Ways and Means Committee and is a member of the Health Subcommittee. Before Representative Chu became the first American woman of Chinese ancestry to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, she served on the Board of Education for the Garvey School District, and then was mayor of Monterey Park, and was then elected to the California State Assembly and the State Board of Equalization. She understands the importance of mental health services, no doubt because of her compassion and the fact that she holds a doctorate in psychology. Some of you know that one of ACA's major legislative priorities is HR 432, the Mental Health Access Improvement Act of 2021. And I want to personally thank Representative Chu for joining the bill as a co-sponsor. That means a great deal to us. She's also the sponsor of the Stop Mental Health Stigma in Our Communities Act, HR 3573. That's a bill that would direct SAMHSA to provide outreach and education strategies for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community by partnering with local advocacy and behavioral health organizations that have an established record of serving AAPIs and would ensure that these strategies reduce stigma associated with mental health conditions and substance abuse. And she also co-sponsored the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, HR 1843, which was a bill that would address the alarming surge in anti-Asian violence during the COVID-19 pandemic by improving hate crime tracking and reporting and providing resources to victims of hate crimes. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, the Honorable Representative Judy Chu. Representative Chu.
Well, thank you, Richard, so much for that introduction. I truly appreciate it. And as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I want to thank the American Counseling Association for their leadership in putting together today's event. And I want to thank all of you for taking part. Mental health is not always easy to talk about, especially in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. But after the year we just had, where so many are struggling with the effects of COVID-19 and an historic spike in anti-Asian hate crimes, conversations on AAPIs and mental health have never been more important. Even before there were quarantine orders or social distancing requirements, there was anti-Asian bigotry and misinformation spreading almost as quickly as the virus itself. In my district, AAPI-owned businesses were some of the first to close their doors. As a result of all of this, we've seen over 7,500 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents since just last year. That's why right at the start of the pandemic, we in CAPAC issued guidance urging every member of Congress to avoid spreading xenophobia or stoking anti-Asian hate. And it is why we called out political leaders like former President Trump, who continued to use slurs like Kung flu, Wuhan flu, and China virus in order to deflect attention away from his own failed response to the pandemic. But it was not until March when the horrific attacks that killed 8 people, 6 of them Asian women at 3 Asian-owned spas in Georgia, that America finally woke up to the reality of anti-Asian hate. Immediately, I organized a delegation of members of Congress to go to Georgia and meet with the community and the families of those who had been killed. And then, with the help of the business community and many leaders here, we helped build a national movement of awareness and action. Thanks to this work, we passed my resolution to condemn anti-Asian bigotry and honor the lives lost in Georgia. We also passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act out of Congress with bipartisan majorities in both the House and the Senate. This legislation, introduced by Representative Grace Meng and Senator Mazie Hirono, will help improve our hate crimes response by creating a new position at the U.S. Department of Justice to better track and address hate crimes and incidents. And it also includes the text of the Jabir Hara No Hate Act, a bill which I co-led that will provide resources to help state and local law enforcement better track and address anti-Asian hate. And I will never forget standing behind the president at the White House as he signed this historic bill into law. But while this will help us better track the problem of anti-Asian hate and provide resources to fight it, we still need to do more to support victims and the mental health impact of this violence. Because the fact is that with each new report of an innocent Asian American being attacked, many across the country worry, will I be next? And that can take an incredible toll on an individual and on whole communities. That's why right at the start of the pandemic, CAPAC worked with researchers to collect and compile data on the impact of the pandemic on the AAPI community. We specifically asked that they include mental health in that assessment because we knew how important mental health was to the story of AAPIs in the pandemic. This spring, they finished tabulating and analyzing the results of that survey, and they found that 3 in 10 Asian American adults faced discrimination during the pandemic, and that 75% of Asian Americans believe that the US had become more dangerous for Asian Americans over the course of the year. They also found that out of everything in the past year, the greatest stressor on the Asian American community during the pandemic was mental health. It's clear that we must do more to address the mental health needs of the AAPI community, because we know these attacks on Asian Americans have led to increased stigmatization and racial trauma in our communities. And yet, AAPIs are less likely than other racial groups to seek mental health services, which is a problem that's often exacerbated due to systemic barriers to even just accessing culturally and linguistically competent care. That's why this May, I introduced a resolution designating May 10th as National Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Mental Health Day to raise awareness of the importance of mental health for the AAPI community. I'm also one of 2 psychologists in Congress, so I know firsthand the problem of the stigma in the AAPI community and how that prevents many AAPIs from seeking or receiving the treatment they so desperately need, either for themselves or for loved ones. So that's why I also reintroduced my bill, the Stop Mental Health Stigma in Our Communities Act, which would create a grant program at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, or SAMHSA, specifically for outreach and access to mental health resources for the AAPI community. This program would connect AAPIs, including those who are direct victims of hate crimes, to culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health services from trusted providers who are already working in our communities. From standing up against hate to encouraging members of our community to treat their mental health as seriously as they treat their physical health, there's so much that we can do to stand up for our community. As counselors, you're on the forefront of providing care to the AAPI community. That's why I'm so glad that you're having this critical discussion today. Thank you for all that you're doing to elevate and address mental health.
Thank you, Representative Chu. Those were outstanding remarks, and I know they mean a lot to those who are on the call tonight. I know we only have you for a brief period of time, but I'd like to ask you a question or two, if that's okay.
Sure.
Let me ask you this. As a mental health professional, you know how people like our members are strong advocates for their clients and their students. And as many of them are grassroots advocates, what is your advice on how they can work with public policy officials in their communities to help support the AAPI community?
Well, the number one thing we can do is to make sure that AAPIs understand that mental health is as important to treat as physical health. Now, you see from that study that I talked about, which by the way was conducted by leaders of the Asian American Psychological Association, I was actually astounded myself as to how many Asian Americans expressed that mental health was an issue. But we know that not enough Asian Americans are actually doing something about it. And that is seeking out mental health treatment services. And why? Because stigma is such a huge problem that keeps AAPIs from even talking about mental health issues, even with close friends and family members. Instead, they feel shame about feelings that are completely normal. This neglect, though, results in disproportionate rates of suicide and depression in our community. And in fact, only 23% of AAPI adults with a mental illness were able to receive treatment in 2019. I mean, that's pretty astounding, less than a quarter. More alarmingly, suicide is the second leading cause of death for Asian or Pacific Islander youth aged 15 to 24. And AAPI women over 65 have the highest rates of suicide of any racial or ethnic group. So all of our efforts should be to normalize these conversations and help more people understand this is just about taking care of yourself.
Well said. So as you look at this Congress and the next session of Congress, what legislative actions do you think you and your colleagues can take on both sides of the aisle that can help the AAPI community increase access to mental health services?
Well, of course, I talked about my resolution designating May 10th as National Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Mental Health Day. And of course, that was to raise the awareness of the importance of mental health for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. But what really gets to the heart of the matter is my bill, the Stop Mental Health Stigma in Our Communities Act, which would create the grant program at SAMHSA specifically for outreach and access to mental health resources for AAPI communities. That is necessary in order to connect people suffering from mental health problems or issues with culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health services that can address their needs in a more holistic way. I actually specifically designed this bill to work with trusted partners already providing care in AAPI communities, rather than trying to invent the wheel. So by utilizing these kinds of partnerships with community organizations, we can reach more people who might be struggling. We certainly have a struggle in general in our legislation and in our system in terms of mental health parity. So that's something I've battled the whole time. And one of the proudest things that I felt so great about was for the ACA and the essential benefits to have mental health services be one of the essential benefits. But I tell you, it's been a long, hard road to get true parity for mental health. And so in general, that's what we need to do as well, because we need to make sure that our whole healthcare system does indeed treat mental health with the same kind of effort that it does physical health.
And is your sense that we can make the argument that this isn't a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, but this is an issue for everyone? I mean, are you starting to sense that among some of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle?
Yes, actually, I also belong to the Mental Health Caucus, and we have discussions. Well, actually, both Democrats and Republicans are members of the caucus, and we have seminars and discussions with key leaders in Congress. And I can tell you for sure that there are Republicans that are just as concerned with making sure that there are those mental health resources out there and that we improve the system.
That is excellent. That is good to hear. I know our members, obviously live in all sorts of congressional districts, and they will certainly do whatever they can to help you in the legislation that you're sponsoring and co-sponsoring. So thank you. I know that you have to run, so I just want to let you know that it is a real honor for us to have you join us for this special event. I know I speak for Dr. Butler and our several hundred attendees, as well as our members, when I say that the American Counseling Association is very appreciative of all your efforts. So thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate you all and all your work.
Thanks. Okay. Well, at this time, I have the honor of introducing you to two more friends of the American Counseling Association. And they have agreed to join us to respond to some questions we have about the important work being done at the state level regarding AAPI issues. So let me introduce State Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos, who has been an activist for more than 4 decades. She was elected to the Washington State House of Representatives in 1998. She chairs the House Education Committee and serves on the House Capital Budget Committee and Consumer Protection and Business Committee. She also serves appointments to the Washington State Education Opportunity Gap Accountability and Oversight Committee, the Every Student Succeeds Act Consolidated Plan Team, and the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership. She clearly is a very busy elected official, and her legislative proposals reflect her strong advocacy for providing quality early learning programs for young children, ensuring a well-trained educator workforce, and closing that opportunity gap that we all know exists. Representative Santos believes Washington State must strive for providing education excellence and opportunities for all students to learn. I can tell you that outside of education, her key policy interests include civil rights, women's rights, economic and environmental justice, affordable housing, and quality public education. Our other panelist tonight is State Senator Chris Lee, who serves in the Hawaii State Legislature, a position he was elected to last year. He's already the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee and was appointed to the Energy, Economic Development, and Tourism Committee. And not for nothing, he won his Senate seat with 65% of the vote. Previously, as a member of the Hawaii House of Representatives, where he served for 12 years, Senator Lee chaired the Energy and Environmental Protection Committee and was on both Judiciary and Water and Land Committees. Senator Lee is known as a progressive policy leader for his work that has broken new ground on difficult issues. The Sunrise Movement recognized Senator Lee as likely, quote, the most accomplished climate change legislator in the country. The Progressive Campaign Change Committee included Senator Lee on their political power list for his long list of accomplishments and helping to build the power of the progressive community. So please help me welcome Representative Santos and Senator Lee. I'd like to ask Representative Santos to start us off with some remarks, and then I'll ask Senator Lee to do the same before we get to our questions.
Well, thank you so very much, Richard, and to the American Counseling Association for the invitation to join Congresswoman Chu and Senator Lee this evening to speak to you about AAPI issues and counseling. My background is, as you noted, as a general activist in the Asian Pacific American community, and I feel very fortunate. I grew up in a commonly configured Asian Pacific American household. I lived with an immigrant father and an American-born mother. My mother was incarcerated during the Second World War in Colorado at the age of 9. My father immigrated post-war to the United States. And largely I was raised in an immigrant community because my father's occupation was as a pastor to the elderly immigrants of our community, the Japanese-speaking community. And so my first language was largely Japanese, none of which I recall now, I'm sad to say. I learned much of my political stances and activism from both of my parents, actually. My mother being a union leader in the Education Association and standing up not only for good pay, and the rights of teachers, but also making sure that issues that are important to Asian Pacific Islanders were represented not only in her union, but at the national level as well. My father, on the other hand, worked very hard to make sure that our immigrant elders were well cared for into their golden years. And so this type of experience really imbued in me a sense of my duty to care for our elders, but also my responsibility to stand up for our rights. I think I would conclude by simply saying I serve and have served for the past 23 years in the Washington State House of Representatives, making me the longest serving person of color in the Washington State Legislature. I'm very envious of the Hawaii legislature, where such a distinction would be very difficult to achieve. But I serve, as you noted, as the chair of the House Education Committee, in large part because seeing those educational opportunity gaps that so disproportionately affect children of color, including students who are Asian American and Pacific Islander, and I would love to be able to respond to any questions that may arise around that. The last thing I will say is I'm very proud to represent the district in which I was raised. My worldview, my values, and my focus have all been informed by the communities and the individuals who helped raise me on the most diverse legislative district in the state. And with that, I will look forward to the questions that you will pose later.
Thank you so much. That was a nice introduction. We appreciate that. Senator Lee, do you have a few things to share with us?
Sure, thank you very much. I appreciate the comments from a good representative. I think if we had an AAPI committee in Hawaii, it would be a committee of the whole. It's pretty much everybody. But also, I mean, that goes back a long ways to AJAs and many generations who have fought long and hard to make Hawaii what it is today. And yet we are in this interesting transition right now where we're going from sort of that singular mindset. What was it to be either Asian or Pacific Islander or AAPI generally, now seeing prominent differences arise as new generations sort of take hold. And we're in a place where most of my friends are starting to feel that one way or another. I mean, I'm half Japanese. I come from a Chinese family with a whole varied background, going back many generations. And in Hawaii, it's that way for pretty much everybody, where we're facing extreme differences between communities and extreme difficulties and challenges on health, on substance abuse, and rates of incarceration. You know, we're dealing with police reform like everywhere else, where certain members of the population are far more disadvantaged and incarcerated at far higher rates than anybody else. Climate change is another stressor that is more recent, but adding another layer that is affecting people. And we're a place where even on race, you know, we go back to 1959 when we became a state, and Martin Luther King Jr. at the time addressed our legislature, flew to Hawaii and addressed our legislature and noted that we were a beacon of racial harmony, but granted with a lot of work yet to do. And still today, we strive to achieve that equality, that recognition, that respect that everybody deserves. And we're not there yet, but we're learning a lot still. And we have, I think, still a role to play as a community, as leaders, and as one state in this great nation in that fight for building that better union. And ultimately, it comes down to, I think, and I really appreciate having, I think, our perspectives at the state level, because we can talk about what the president's doing, what Congress is doing, but when you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed, you know, 90% of the things that are going to affect you on your way to work, when you send your kids to school, what kind of healthcare you get, all of that is decided often at the state and local level, are definitely very heavily influenced by that. So making sure that there's that kind of buy-in and that kind of advocacy and cooperation with those local leaders is so critical, because it will make or break, I think, the outcomes that communities see. So I really want to take my hat off to everyone who's working on these projects in their own communities, because it is the support that we absolutely need, I think, as elected leaders to be able to prioritize the things, the funding, the programs, policy, all that stuff that needs to be put in place in order to have good outcomes. And with that, thank you very much for having me. Look forward to having a good discussion.
Great. Thank you very much for those remarks. I think I'd like to start with a question that for both of you, and I'd like to know what unique public health and mental health issues you're seeing occur in your state, and how might counselors and other mental health providers work with their elected officials to find policy solutions for these issues.
Well, Senator, if you don't mind, I'll just go ahead and start. And I think the issues that we are seeing come to the forefront at the moment have a lot to do with the isolation that we've experienced as a nation under COVID restrictions, the challenges of race that have never been resolved in our country. But in fact, what we are seeing, in my opinion, is an exacerbation of those fault lines that have existed within our society for many, many years. I can't help but, because I recall when then President Reagan went through the whole devolution process. That, I think, really both created an opportunity, which I'll speak to in a moment. I don't think we realized at the time, but it really stressed our states. It stressed our state budgets, it stressed our communities, it stressed our community-based organizations, it stressed our families and our individuals, because all of a sudden there were many people who are not receiving necessary mental health services in particular, as well as those who were in prison who were let out because of the devolution, and many of them were receiving those necessary mental health services institutionally. I think the opportunity that was created, and it's something that I think it's taken all of these decades to realize, is that for many of our family members, for our community members, a community-based response is actually a better response, a more humane response, and a more loving response. And so when I take a look at what's going on today in Washington State, what we are seeing is sort of the accumulation of decades of the devolution experience plus the exacerbation of COVID, and laying on top of that the racial animosity. And what I'm seeing is, frankly, great trauma. Great trauma that is being played out on a daily basis with increased violence, with increased incidences of mental health crises on the streets, increased homelessness, and those are all challenges that will take all of us working together at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level to address.
I couldn't agree more. And I'd add also that, I think we're also starting to see, and this hasn't really been quantified in a way that I think we've yet to really get a handle on, but we know there's some data out there clearly showing that generationally as well, the challenges faced by the many in the last, 2 or 3 decades are now different in some cases than those being faced here today. You have younger folks who tend to be, in some cases, explicitly avoiding having kids because of the stresses they face and the toll that can take on relationships, on their quality of life, among many other things, is something that I think from the government's perspective, we have no idea how to handle yet. There's a lot of underlying factors when it comes to what is being addressed and what we're learning, year after year. And I think COVID really amplifies a lot of this in ways that we still don't fully understand, and will probably continue to learn for years, maybe decades to come. So I do think there's an interesting lens if you put yourself in different communities, different generations, different ethnicities' shoes, and try and look through that. We see different problems arise that all deserve to be addressed.
Oh, absolutely. And, as professional counselors, our members of ACA are uniquely sort of like tuned into the occurrence of traumatic events, like you're talking about, and actions that go on in our culture. And I think as a result, ACA did issue a statement condemning rising hate crimes targeting Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in the aftermath of the pandemic. And we've worked to raise that awareness of the trauma and mental health impact of hate crimes on individuals and communities. I guess the question I'd have for both of you is, how have your communities and states responded to the rise in hate crimes, and how might counselors in your state get involved?
I'll jump in this time. I think we have Hawaii being just so overwhelmingly diverse has been a great benefit for us, but we still are no exception, I think, to the rise in animosity and hate crimes and everything else that have been seen around the country. And, it's been great because I think we have this long history of dealing specifically with AAPI kinds of crimes going back long before Hawaii was a state. And we have pretty good networks of folks who are able to cope with this and work on it. But still, I think what we're finding ourselves is still flat-footed. We thought we were past, I think, a lot of this up until recently. And yet we still find today that we have rise in numbers of these things. And so what we've been doing is actually purposely trying to refocus on the issue, to remind folks that even though Hawaii is assumed to be this melting pot of ethnicities and everything else from around the Pacific, that ourselves, we are susceptible to this. And we look right now, especially at our Micronesian community. We're one of the only states that has a lot of folks who have a legal right to come back to the United States, and Hawaii is a place where they choose to go because the United States has had a great impact on their home islands. And yet we often as a community view them with suspicion. They're treated in ways that we would have hoped we have long since got past. And a lot of it is racial, and a lot of it is prejudice and all sorts of stuff. And so that's sort of where we're focused right now, trying to deal with that situation. And it's difficult. We find it's equally challenging because we catch ourselves hearing this out in our community being talked about in ways that is just absolutely uncomfortable if you were to replace that term Micronesian ethnicity with any other. And that's something that we are just now really starting to bite into and acknowledge that this is an absolute problem and it is unacceptable.
Thank you. The the challenges that we have faced, again, as a nation, in addressing racially charged crimes of hate and bias is something that at the state level, we prioritized during our past immediately concluded legislative session. We had identified really a short list of issues. Since we were doing everything remotely, we wanted to be very modest about our expectations of getting work done. But the very first issue on our list was policies would have to deal with racial justice. The others would be having to deal with COVID, trying to take advantage of creating greater revenue sources, in the climate change justice. Those were the key things. And I'm very proud that as a state, we prioritized issues dealing with racial justice. And there was a whole host of legislative policies adopted to advance racial justice policies. But in addition to that, in the immediate aftermath of the Georgia shootings and the murders of the Sikh in the Midwest, everyone from the governor to the county executive in my county, named after Martin Luther King Jr., as well as the mayor of the city of Seattle, stepped forward with members of the Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian communities to not only very publicly and consistently condemn hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders and other people of color. But I'm proud to say that King County stepped forward immediately to fund $5 million to support multicultural media in the mainstream and to create a coalition to work against hate and bias throughout the county, forging together more than 23 community-based organizations, from the Chinese Information Service Center to the Muslim Advocacy Organization to the Pacific Islanders, Pacifica. Our city, in addition, added $1.5 million to that pot to ensure that we had strong ways to take in complaints around hate crimes and bias, because I think somebody previously noted that Asian Pacific Islanders have been very reluctant to step forward and call for help, partly because we have felt so invisible and there was no way to call these crimes actually crimes. So we have a very active state commission on Asian and Pacific American affairs that is working with our community-based organizations to ensure that we are disseminating both bystander training through Hollaback, as well as to make sure that we are working with our law enforcement officials, from prosecutors to the beat cops, to understand how to respond, especially when you think about so many of our community members being linguistically isolated and therefore being marginalized.
Wow, that's terrific. That's great to hear. I like all the efforts that are being made. And it just shows how it needs to be done at very different, not only different levels, but within different segments of each community. I'm going to jump a little bit on to ask Senator Lee a question. Given that Hawaii is an island, it makes sense that you have focused a substantial amount of your career on climate-related policy. And the Pacific Islander community is, uniquely vulnerable to and facing a disproportionate fallout from climate change. So at ACA, we're interested in that intersection between mental health and climate change. How would you describe the impact climate is having on your state and your constituents? And is there any movement in Hawaii to address the stress and anxiety caused by climate change?
Yeah, I think we are positioning ourselves now, not only for the impacts that we're going to feel next year and the year after, but certainly decades down the road. And what that also looks like, I think touching on our last question about race and community, is being a refugee hub for other Pacific Island nations that are literally losing their land, the communities that are being torn apart and have no ability to relocate. We're going to have a lot of that we're going to have to deal with, and we know it's coming. So we know that the challenge is before us. What we're really focusing on right now in dealing with climate and its impacts, we have a generation, I think, folks who tend to be older, who own their own homes, who are fairly set in their life at this point and comfortable, who are reaping benefits from a lot of climate action. So putting in solar and renewables, which is reducing costs and giving some benefit there that is tangible in a way that I think helps, just helps. I think for folks who are younger, who are already facing a high cost of living and dealing with climate on top of that, who are trying to plan out where they want to live. In some cases, I have a friend, for example, whose family is losing their property on the edge of the ocean to erosion. They're probably not going to have it. I mean, it's in 20 or 30 years not going to be there, like literally not going to be there anymore. So there goes the inheritance, that generations have worked for. There's all these kinds of things that we're just now discovering. But what we're trying to do is actually translate this out of climate speak and into something that is tangible and actionable, right? No one, I think, meaningfully understands what it's going to be like to try and set a policy that 40 years from now is going to handle some kids' future. It's just too ethereal. But what we're looking at are those impacts today. So for families who are trying to raise kids, who are going to pay for college, who want to have some sort of path in the community, you've got to deal with climate in a way that translates that into meaningful action. So in the context of that, we're setting aside funds, millions of dollars. We're creating new positions in government, and especially to deal with, I think, the nexus here, where you have these communities that are being pushed around because of climate change, where you have unlikely neighbors coming together, causing tension. And I think the same kinds of things that we've been talking about so far with police reform and all of that. We're trying to fund positions that would put mental health professionals in those places of key contact, where you'd have, for example, with law enforcement dealing with substance abuse, mental health professionals can be that intermediary so that it's not just hitting the same nail with a hammer every single time and sending someone to jail or to court, but rather providing them an avenue that provides treatment and diversion. It's these kinds of things that we think about. Climate has nothing to do with this, but it actually does, because if we can get those systems in place, then we can deal with climate impacts. We can deal with all of that, which is this beast that is going to dwarf all the issues that we face today, with more refugees, not only domestically within our state from families who are displaced, but within a tremendous cost of living increase because of what it's going to take to adapt to climate. And then, of course, with refugees from out of our state coming in. So it is a tsunami of challenge that we face and cost, but we're starting today in this small place where we see already tension rising.
Okay, well, it's you make some very powerful arguments, and I think that when you look at what those interrelationships are, climate, mental health, law enforcement, racism, I mean, it all really does kind of come together. I have one more question, Representative Santos. Throughout your career, you've focused on community-based solutions to critical public health concerns, and that includes equity and inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about lessons learned from the community activism throughout your career, and how might mental health providers and counselors apply those lessons in their own communities and in their own advocacy efforts to support greater inclusion and equity in public health?
Yeah, sure. Again, I was very fortunate to be raised in an activist family, so I didn't have to look far for the models. And so I'd like to just use a couple of very personal examples in trying to respond to your question. As I mentioned before, my father is a pastor, and his congregants were the elderly. And you might recall that because of the Asian Exclusion Act, though my father immigrated after World War II, when finally Asians were able to come to the United States, most of his congregants had come to the United States before 1924. So they were quite old already. And as they aged, and for those who needed nursing care, they found themselves in largely white Western institutional facilities. And my father, in doing his work, would visit his parishioners wherever they might be. And what he found was that his parishioners were suffering, not only physically because of their age and perhaps other physical ailments, but emotionally and mentally, they were failing because they didn't have people to speak to. They didn't have food that felt familiar. One story is of a gentleman who always asked for nickels from his visitors. And when queried as to why he needed these nickels, he said he had to give a nickel to attendants to get them to pay attention to them. To him. And needless to say, this is not what we envision for our elders. And so I was very proud that one of my father's achievements was to work with the other pastors in the area, social workers and family members in the Seattle area, to build the first Japanese convalescent home in Seattle. Known as Cairo. There was a lot of modeling after what it takes place in, I think, LA actually might have had the very first example. And it was an important achievement where our elders could actually thrive even as they were aging, and they could receive culturally competent care. And so the lesson there is you hold the answers for solutions to problems that surface in your community. I think in some ways, maybe it's a little more difficult now than it may have been then, but I still think it's important to remember that communities hold the solutions for the problems that they encounter. Another example is I'm very some of your members may be familiar with Asian Counseling and Referral Service in the Seattle area. It is a multi-service agency, but it started off as a mental health, and that still is sort of its cornerstone service, is a mental health service agency. My cousin and my husband were instrumental in starting ACRS off. Why? Well, my cousin happened to be an associate professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work, and my husband was part of the group of civil rights activists who, and together, Tony, my cousin, Bob, my husband, saw that with the increasing number of refugees from Southeast Asia who were coming into the Seattle area, they were dealing with great trauma, not only coming from war-torn countries, but also the refugee experience itself was traumatic. And the services that needed to occur ranged from sort of how do you transition into a new homeland where you don't know how anything works, to really some of the deep-seated PTSD that many of these refugees first experienced. And so they started off by just creating, they used my father's church to just start seeing people. And at first people didn't want to come in. But one of the early volunteers, because they worked through volunteers, started offering people tea and just a time to talk. And so it was a very non-threatening approach to trying to get people to talk about what are the challenges that they were facing. In addition, Tony, my cousin, through his work at the School of Social Work, sort of spearheaded this notion of community service. What do they call it? I want to say apprenticeship, but it's a community service residency, I guess, where students, as part of their education, actually went into communities to see what are the emerging issues. Now, that probably doesn't sound really earth-shattering today, but at the time, in the early 70s, that was a very earth-shattering practice. And so I think the lesson from that is really sort of a riff on the earlier one, which is to not be afraid to step into where others have not before, and allow those who are hurting to tell you what they need.
That is excellent. That is a great story, and I certainly appreciate it. I think we can learn a lot from what some of us and some of the folks we know from years ago did. I want to be respectful of the time that our guests have, and Senator Lee, Representative Santos, we have come to the end of our panel questions, and I want to really extend our thank yous and our alohas to you for the good work that you continue to do. We appreciate so much of what you're doing. It's not just your work. I know it's your dedication and it's your compassion, and that means a lot to us. It means a lot to your constituents as well. I know that. Before we do close, I want to introduce Gila Todd, our Government Affairs Manager, and Dominique Marsalek, our Government Affairs Specialist. They have a quick update for all of you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, panelists. The Increasing Access to Mental Health in Schools Act, introduced by Representative Chu, addresses urgent need for increased behavioral health services in schools, as well as the Stop Mental Health Stigma in Our Communities Act, which addresses mental health stigma within the AAPI community. If anyone would like to learn more about these bills, as well as additional federal legislation, please go to our Take Action page, where you can become more involved in ACA's advocacy efforts that support the AAPI community. Right now, I'm going to kick it over to Dominique, where she'll discuss legislation within the states.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dominique Marsalek, Government Affairs Specialist at the American Counseling Association, and I lead our state portfolio. At ACA, we encourage our members to stay involved at all levels of policy, including our local communities and our state. We encourage you to support Asian American and Pacific Islander communities throughout your state by pursuing guidelines and legislation that will mitigate the negative effects of anti-Asian hate and contribute to the overall health and well-being of these communities. You can find resources on how to engage your governor on state policy and legislation impacting the Asian American and Pacific Islander community on our website now at counseling.org/government-affairs/state issues. For more information, please reach out to our Government Affairs and Public Policy team at advocacy@counseling.org. Thank you, and back to our CEO, Richard Yep, to close out our event tonight.
Thanks, Dominique. Again, ACA wants to thank Representative Santos, Senator Lee, and Representative Chu. And of course, we want to thank all of you, our audience, who joined us for this really enlightening and powerful event. Like Dominique and Gila said, go to the ACA website, go to the Take Action page. And there's a lot of good information that I think is really important for all of us. What I would say is, remember to stay engaged, empower your colleagues to get engaged, and stay involved. And again, make sure you go to counseling.org and take some action there. One last reminder, the ACA Color Me Brave event is tomorrow, July 22nd from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern via our Facebook Live page. And it's going to highlight issues related to communities, the workplace, and personal experiences central to the well-being of mental health. We will have speakers there, Dr. Rufus Tony Spann, who's a licensed professional counselor, State Senator Bobby Powell Jr. from Florida, and Assistant Chief Morgan Kane from the Washington, D.C. Police Department. Again, thank you to all of you. This was a great event, and I really appreciate our elected officials who joined us tonight. I know I speak for Dr. Butler as well, so thanks very much. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.